We're in this kitchen in North Scottsdale. I've already done some of the crown molding. I'm gonna just take this one area as an example because it has both flat ends, inside corners, and outside corners. So first step, you need a tape measure, pencil, and something to mark on. I'm just gonna draw out a rough drawing of the whole thing, and then I'm going to mark down every single one of these measurements. So I've got all my measurements marked down. I'm going to go outside and cut them. So basic table saw setup. Helps a lot to have it in ergonomic height so you're not crouching over. A nice miter stand will give you extended wings for the length of your material. So one of the first things you want to check is how straight your boards are. These ones have a little bit of curve going down them, but they're all curved the same way, so you do what you got to do with what you do. So the weird thing about crown molding is you can't cut it like this because there's nothing supporting it. So you actually cut it upside down so it's supported at both edges on the fence. You always cut your longest pieces first. I cut all of my pieces just a little bit oversized just to make sure, maybe a 16th or a 32nd oversized, and then I put them into place and mark and cut them again if I have to. Measure twice, cut as many times as you need. Also, for consistency's sake, find out what the height that you're going to have your crown molding at, and you need to make sure that it's at the same height every time, because if you're cutting and your crown molding is at different angles, your pieces aren't going to fit up right. Also, just a general note, since you're cutting everything upside down, all of these are backwards. So if I was cutting this piece, you know, there's a miter right here and a flat right here. I'm actually going to be cutting the miter on the left side because it's upside down. So just something to take into consideration. Next, I'm going to cut this 31 and 15/16, so it's going to be upside down. I'm going to cut just a regular 90-degree cross cut on the left side, and then a 90-degree inside miter on the right side. Just going to cut a few inches off the edge because that factory edge is kind of ugly. It's usually messed up the last couple inches just because the way they cut the molding. So I make sure I'm lined up with my mark on both sides, just so the wood isn't twisted. And then, I don't know if you can see it, but I've got my mark I want to cut at. Oftentimes you'll mark and then mark your waist side. So I want my miter to come right up to the base of this line right here. I'm going to cut a little bit long and then slowly work my way up to the line. So from there, you just work your way down your cut list, cutting from biggest to smallest. That way you don't end up with a bunch of tiny little scraps that you can't cut your long pieces out of. So now I got all my cuts. Now it's time to go inside and see if they work. A little too tight, so I'm just going to shave a little bit off of the 90-degree end. Definitely easier than trying to cut a thin slice off of a miter. So I like to use a 21 gauge brad nailer. They leave a tiny pinhole and still pretty strong. You can also use a 23 gauge or an 18 gauge, but the 18 are messy and the 23 gauge aren't as strong. So we're getting into some stuff I honestly don't even really know how to explain, other than sometimes you just gotta fumble around a little bit to make them match up. There's fling glue everywhere. Distinctly unprofessional. So a lot of times, I mean, this is almost close enough to fit and I could probably shove it in, but you don't want to do that because if you squeeze something to fit in, it probably is going to displace something else and jank one of your angles. So it can be kind of difficult to get outside miters to close up. So these are called pinch clamps. They're just specially made to close miters together. So pinch clamps definitely aren't ideal. They do leave little marks, but I'd rather leave some marks and have my miter actually close together, which can be really difficult when you're using bowed hardwood. And then once they're pinched into a good spot, you can nail it to sort of solidify things. I'll just leave those there until the glue dries. So that's a quick lesson on how to do crown molding. If you have any questions, let me know. There's probably a lot more detail I could have gone into, but I think that's a good start. Finite! That crown molding is straight, and you can see how bowed the ceiling is. You can see it touches there, and then huge, like 3/8 inch gap. We'll just have to caulk that in or figure something out. Anyways, derp-a-der! Also, this may go without saying, but if you're carrying a nail gun up 10 feet above the tile, just be aware that you or anyone can trip over that, and 5 pounds of metal falling on a countertop or a floor is something to be aware of. If you're installing crown molding alone, you know, it's kind of hard to hold up both sides at once. You can actually sometimes open up the cabinet doors and lay the crown molding across it. A couple things that I wanted to add. If you're estimating how much material you're going to need, take all of your measurements and probably add a foot to each, just because the miter's probably around 4 inches each, plus, you know, accounting for mistakes, especially if you're new. You're going to cut a lot of stuff wrong. It just takes practice. So I was doing it on cabinets, and if you're doing it on cabinets, obviously you can nail into the cabinet, but if you're doing it up in the, you know, like a corner of a, oh, that's a weird corner. That one is too. If you're doing it in the corner of just a normal room, there's, you know, just the normal studs every 16 inches or so. So what I like to do, if you're doing that, is measure out a 2x4 and cut it on a miter, and screw it into the, you know, the top sill plate. I don't know if that's what it's called, but there's a stud at the top of the ceiling, and you can screw that triangular piece in there, and then when you put your crown molding up, you can just nail straight into that instead of having to measure out and mark for studs while you're up there on a ladder. There's also this distance. I didn't explain it well enough probably, but on your miter saw, when I say you got to align it on your rip fence at the same angle, you want to set your angle and then mark a line all the way across your rip fence, and that way you're cutting it at the same angle every single time. And you also want to mark down, if you're going all the way to the ceiling, you mark from the ceiling down and you make a mark, and that's where the bottom of your molding is. There's going to be some fudging involved because ceilings are never flat. So it's more like guidelines anyhow. Especially if you're new, just think about your cuts before you make them. You're still probably going to mess a bunch of stuff up, but you're marking out all your measurements on the bottom. So when you're, which is confusing because when you cut it, you flip it so it's actually on top. That might make things more confusing, but as far as nail guns, I like to use a 21 gauge nail gun. It's still a pretty small pinhole, but has decent hold. You can also use a 23 gauge, leaves a teensy little hole, but not quite as strong. And an 18 gauge is probably a lot stronger, unnecessarily strong, I would think, but leaves a pretty big hole that you definitely have to address. Depending on what kind of finish the crown molding has, you can get away with a 21 or 23 gauge nail gun. Anyways, I don't know. Hey, if there's anything you want to learn, I'm sort of making my way through all the stuff I've learned in carpentry in the last 5 years or so, and I plan on making like a sort of an overarching carpentry in general. I was just out on a job site and I wanted to I don't know, teach everyone how to do crown molding. So later.